At 6:47 in the morning on September 23, 1942, Private First Class William Lansford sat very still in the bushes of Guadalcanal's jungle, listening to something that wasn't there. He was 21 years old, had been on the island for 14 days, and had zero training for what was killing his squad. The jungle had been screaming moments earlier, parrots yelling, insects buzzing, the constant sound of 1,000 species fighting for attention in the thick treetops above. Then silence. Complete, sudden, scary silence. Lansford had learned what that silence meant 3 days ago. Private Rodriguez had ignored it. Rodriguez was dead before he hit the ground. A single 6.5 millimeter bullet through his forehead. The Japanese sniper who killed him was never found. The pattern was always the same. Marine patrol moves through jungle. Birds fly away. Insects go quiet. Marine steps into a clearing. Crack of a rifle. Another body for the stretcher bearers. Japanese snipers didn't miss. They tied themselves to palm trees with rope and waited for days. They covered their positions with leaves, vines, anything that would break up their shape against the green. They carried rice balls and canteens of water. They went to the bathroom where they lay. They didn't move. They didn't blink. They waited until an American walked into their sights, then squeezed the trigger once. The Marines had no way to stop this. Standard infantry rules were useless in the jungle. You couldn't see more than 20 yards in any direction. You couldn't hear the enemy coming over the noise of the forest. You couldn't set up shooting positions when every line of sight ended in a wall of plants. But the birds knew. The birds always knew. Lansford had grown up hunting white-tailed deer in the pine forests of East Texas. His grandfather, a half-Cherokee tracker named Samuel Coldwater, had taught him to read the woods before he could read books. "Listen to what the forest tells you," the old man had said. "When the birds go quiet, something's coming. When the squirrels stop chattering, freeze and find cover. The animals will tell you what you can't see." Those lessons meant nothing in the training camps of Camp Pendleton. The Marine Corps taught rifle shooting, bayonet drill, beach landing tactics. Nobody mentioned listening to birds. Now 14 days into the Guadalcanal campaign, Lansford understood that his grandfather's lessons were the only things keeping him alive. The silence stretched for 8 seconds. 9. 10. Lansford didn't move. He didn't breathe. He watched the treetops above with eyes that had learned to see without moving. Somewhere in that green tangle of leaves and vines, a Japanese sniper was settling his rifle against a branch, adjusting his aim, preparing to kill another American. The other 5 Marines in his patrol were scattered behind him, following standard procedure. Point man up front, squad leader in the middle. Everyone spread out to reduce deaths from a single burst of fire. None of them had noticed the silence. None of them knew what it meant. Lansford raised his left fist slowly, the hand signal for halt. He prayed the men behind him were watching. He prayed they understood. If you want to discover how Lansford's observation changed Marine Corps jungle warfare rules, hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Pacific. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Lansford. He'd been trying to explain bird behavior to his squad leader, Sergeant Thomas Mercer, for 3 days. Mercer was a Boston Irishman, tough as boiled leather, veteran of the first Guadalcanal landing on August 7th. He'd survived the Battle of the Tenarú River. He'd watched Colonel Gutge's patrol get ambushed and killed near the Matanikau. He didn't trust new ideas from new privates who'd been on the island less than 2 weeks. "Birds don't matter," Mercer had said. "Finding cover matters. Moving fast matters. Killing Japs matters. Birds are just noise." But Lansford had kept watching. He'd kept listening. And he'd started to see a pattern that none of his training had prepared him for. The jungle of Guadalcanal wasn't silent. It was the opposite of silent. During daylight hours, the noise was overwhelming. Thousands of bird species filled the treetops with calls, songs, warnings, mating displays. Cicadas droned, frogs chirped, beetles clicked. The forest was a symphony of sounds so thick that Marines often couldn't hear each other talk at distances of more than 10 feet. That noise was the baseline. That noise was normal. That noise meant the forest was at peace. When the noise stopped, the forest was warning you. Lansford had first noticed it on September 20th during a patrol along the Lunga River. The squad was moving through secondary growth jungle, machetes out, hacking through vines as thick as a man's wrist. The point man, a kid from Iowa named Peterson, was 40 yards ahead when the birds went silent. Not slowly quiet, not gradually fading, silent, instantly, completely. Peterson took 3 more steps before the bullet caught him in the chest. He was dead before the sound of the rifle reached the rest of the patrol. The Marines hit the deck. Standard response: find cover, return fire, locate the enemy. But there was no enemy to locate. The shot had come from somewhere in the treetops, somewhere in the endless green that stretched in every direction. The sniper had fired once and gone silent. 2 hours later, when the patrol finally pulled out Peterson's body and made it back to the base, Lansford pulled Sergeant Mercer aside. "The birds stopped," Lansford said. "Right before the shot, the whole forest went quiet." Mercer wasn't interested. Peterson's dead because some jerk was hiding in a tree, not because of birds. But Lansford couldn't let it go. He'd grown up understanding that animals were the first warning system of any forest. Deer froze when predators came near. Squirrels made alarm calls that echoed for hundreds of yards. Birds scattered when something disturbed their feeding grounds. Every creature in the woods was constantly watching, constantly listening, constantly telling every other creature about danger. The Japanese snipers were predators, the most patient, most deadly predators the Marines had ever faced. They moved slowly, if they moved at all. They wore camouflage that made them invisible against the bark and leaves. They didn't announce their presence with noise or movement, but they couldn't fool the birds. Every time a Japanese sniper climbed into position, every time he shifted his weight, every time he raised his rifle, the birds nearest to him noticed. They stopped calling. They stopped moving. They went still and silent, waiting for the threat to pass. That silence spread outward like a wave. One bird noticed and went quiet. The birds around it noticed the silence and went quiet too. Within seconds, the entire section of forest around the sniper had fallen into unnatural stillness. The Marines just needed to learn to hear it. Lansford started keeping notes. Every time a patrol ran into a sniper, he asked survivors the same questions. Did you notice anything before the shot? Did the jungle sound different? Did anything seem wrong? Most Marines had no idea what he was talking about. They'd been focused on the trail ahead, on not tripping over roots, on watching for tripwires and booby traps. They hadn't been listening to birds, but a few remembered. "Yeah," Private Harris said after his squad lost 2 men near Alligator Creek. "It was weird. Everything got real quiet right before Kowalski got hit, like someone turned off a radio." Corporal Jenkins had a similar story. "We were crossing a creek bed," he said. "Birds everywhere, making all kinds of noise. Then nothing. Dead silence for maybe 5 seconds. Then Thompson took one in the throat." Lansford collected 7 accounts over 8 days. In every case where survivors could remember, the jungle had gone silent between 3 and 15 seconds before the sniper fired. The pattern was real. The warning was there. The Marines just needed to learn how to use it. On September 22nd, Lansford requested a meeting with Captain Andrew Haldane, commanding officer of K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Haldane was different from most company commanders. He listened to his men. He encouraged new ideas. He'd been one of the first officers to see that standard infantry tactics were getting Marines killed in the jungle. Lansford explained his observations. He showed Haldane his notes. He described how the birds went silent when predators came near, and how Japanese snipers caused the same response. Haldane was doubtful but interested. "You're saying we can hear the sniper before he shoots?" "Not hear him, sir. Hear the absence of sound. When the jungle goes quiet, something's wrong. If we teach the men to freeze when the birds stop, we might give them enough time to find cover before the shot." Haldane thought about it for a long moment. "It sounds crazy, Private, but nothing else we've tried has worked. Let's test it." The test came the next morning, September 23rd. Lansford's patrol. Now he crouched in the bushes, fist raised, listening to the silence that told him death was waiting somewhere in the treetops above. The 5 Marines behind him had stopped moving. They'd seen his hand signal. They were waiting for instructions. Lansford's eyes moved slowly across the trees ahead. The sniper was out there, probably within 100 yards, invisible against the green, patient as stone, waiting for movement. The traditional response would be to spray the treetops with automatic fire, to rake the trees until something fell. But that rarely worked. Japanese snipers tied themselves in place. Even if you killed them, the bodies often stayed in the trees for days. And the noise of automatic fire would draw every Japanese soldier within a mile to your position. Lansford tried something different. He stayed absolutely still. He let his eyes adjust to the patterns of light and shadow in the treetops. He looked for anything that broke the natural flow of leaves and branches. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Then he saw it, a shape that didn't belong, a slight bulge against a palm trunk, 60 yards ahead and 30 feet up, the outline of shoulders, the curve of a helmet wrapped in vines. Lansford lowered his right hand slowly. He pointed at the shape. He looked back at Corporal Williams, the squad's best shot, and acted out raising a rifle. Williams understood. He brought his M1903 Springfield to his shoulder with painful slowness, aiming through the 4-power scope that had been given to special marksmen. He took his time. He controlled his breathing. The shot cracked across the jungle. The shape in the palm tree jerked once and went limp. The bird started singing again. Captain Haldane was impressed enough to make the training official. Within a week, K Company had developed a simple set of rules for patrol movements in the jungle. Point man listens for bird calls. If calls stop, patrol freezes. Everyone scans treetops for 10 seconds before moving. The results were immediate. In the 2 weeks before the rules, K Company had lost 11 men to sniper fire during patrols. In the 2 weeks after, they lost 3. The reduction wasn't total. Sometimes snipers were too well hidden to spot. Sometimes the silence came too late. But the Marines were finally fighting back against an enemy they couldn't see. Word spread through the 1st Marine Division. Other companies started asking about the bird listening technique. Officers who had dismissed the idea as nonsense were forced to think again when the death numbers came in. Sergeant Mercer, the Boston Irishman who told Lansford that birds didn't matter, became one of the technique's strongest supporters. He'd seen it work too many times to doubt it anymore. The birds are like guard dogs, Mercer told new replacements. They bark when something's wrong. Learn to hear when they stop barking. By October, the technique had been added to patrol training for the entire 1st Marine Division. The Scout Sniper School that had been set up at Guadalcanal in September began including bird behavior in its classes. Instructors who had never heard of the concept were suddenly teaching it to every man who came through the program. The official Marine Corps name was Environmental Awareness Indicators. The Marines on the ground called it bird silence or Lansford's warning. Either way, it worked. The science behind the technique was simple. Birds are prey animals. They survive by being constantly alert to predators. When a possible threat enters their territory, they go silent to avoid drawing attention to themselves. This behavior is the same across bird species, from the tropical parrots of the Pacific Islands to the sparrows of American backyards. Japanese snipers caused this response because they moved like predators, slowly, carefully, climbing into positions where they could watch and wait. The birds didn't know the difference between a Japanese soldier and a python. They just knew something dangerous was in the trees. The silence itself was clear, not a slow fading of sound, but a sudden change. One moment, the treetops were full of calls and songs. The next moment, nothing. The contrast was so strong that Marines who learned to notice it could rarely ignore it afterward. The challenge was teaching men to hear what they'd been trained to ignore. Standard infantry training focused on seeing things. Watch your area, scan for movement, identify targets. Nobody had thought to include listening because modern battlefields were too loud for it to matter. But the jungle was different. The jungle was a wall of sound that suddenly went silent when something was wrong. Marines who learned to hear that silence gained precious seconds of warning, seconds that could mean the difference between diving for cover and taking a bullet. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commander of the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, heard about the technique during the planning for the Battle of Edson's Ridge in mid-September. He was doubtful at first. Edson was a Marine's Marine, hard as nails, focused on firepower and aggressive tactics. But he also understood that the jungle was killing his men in ways they hadn't been trained to handle. Japanese snipers were claiming victims at a rate that threatened to break the Marine defense of Henderson Field. Something had to change. Edson ordered his raiders to practice the bird listening technique during their defensive preparations on the ridge. When the Japanese launched their major attack on September 12th through 14th, his men were better prepared to find and stop sniper positions than any other unit on the island. The Battle of Edson's Ridge was a bloody, desperate fight. Over 1,000 Japanese soldiers died trying to break through the Marine lines. But the raiders held, and in the after-action reports, multiple officers credited the bird listening technique with helping them locate sniper positions during daytime operations. The technique spread beyond Guadalcanal. As the Pacific Campaign ground forward through 1943 and 44, Marines carried the knowledge to Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and eventually Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Not every battlefield was suitable. The coral islands of the Central Pacific had few birds and little plants. The volcanic wasteland of Iwo Jima offered no jungle treetops for snipers or wildlife. But wherever Marines fought in thick jungle terrain, the bird listening technique saved lives. Eugene Sledge, who would later write the classic memoir, With the Old Breed, learned the technique during his training before the Peleliu invasion in September 1944. Veteran sergeants who had survived Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester taught new replacements how to read the jungle sounds. The veterans made us practice until we could hear it, Sledge later remembered. They'd have us sit in the jungle with our eyes closed, just listening. After a while, you could tell when something was wrong. The silence had a weight to it. The technique became part of Marine Corps knowledge. After the war, it was added to jungle warfare training programs. When Marines went to Vietnam in the 1960s, they learned the same skills that Lansford had discovered on Guadalcanal 20 years earlier. Modern combat tracking and environmental awareness training still includes the concept. The Marine Corps Jungle Warfare Training Center on Okinawa teaches Marines to listen to animal behavior as part of their survival classes. The lesson that Lansford learned from his Cherokee grandfather has been passed down through 3 generations of Marine jungle fighters. But back on Guadalcanal in September 1942, Lansford didn't know that he was changing military history. He just knew that listening to birds was keeping him alive. The patrol continued after Williams killed the sniper. Lansford stayed on point, ears straining for any break in the jungle's constant noise. Behind him, 5 Marines moved with new awareness, their attention split between the trail ahead and the sounds around them. They ran into 2 more silent zones that day. The first lasted only 4 seconds before the birds started their calls again. False alarm, probably a snake or a monitor lizard moving through the bushes. The second was different. The silence stretched for nearly 20 seconds. Lansford froze. The patrol froze behind him. Everyone scanned the treetops with desperate intensity. This time, Williams spotted the sniper first. He fired before Lansford could even locate the target. Another Japanese soldier tumbled from the trees, his body catching on vines before dropping to the forest floor. 2 snipers in one patrol, both found by bird silence, both killed before they could fire. When the patrol returned to the base that evening, Lansford reported to Captain Halding. The captain listened carefully, asked detailed questions about timing and distance, and made notes in a small leather journal. "You've given us something, Private," Haldane said. "I don't know if the brass will ever acknowledge it, but you've given us a fighting chance." Lansford was promoted to corporal the following week. He continued improving the technique throughout the Guadalcanal campaign, training other Marines to hear what he heard, to freeze when the jungle went silent. He survived Guadalcanal. He survived Cape Gloucester. He survived Peleliu, where the technique was less useful in the coral ridges, but still valuable in the jungle patches that covered parts of the island. He was wounded on Okinawa in May 1945, a Japanese mortar fragment tearing through his left thigh. He was taken to a hospital ship and eventually to a stateside hospital in San Diego. He never saw combat again. After the war, Lansford returned to East Texas. He married a girl he'd known since high school. He took over his father's small hardware store. He raised 3 children and taught all of them to hunt. He never talked much about the war. When people asked about his service, he'd mention Guadalcanal and change the subject. He didn't tell stories about killing or dying or the constant terror of jungle combat, but he taught his children to listen to birds. He taught them what silence meant in the forest. He passed down the knowledge that his grandfather had given him, the knowledge that had saved his life and the lives of countless other Marines. William Lansford died in 1993 at the age of 72. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service, but said nothing about bird silence or jungle warfare rules. The Marines who served with him remembered differently. In reunions and letters and recorded oral histories, they spoke about the East Texas private who taught them to hear what they couldn't see. "He saved my life," Sergeant Thomas Mercer said in a 1982 interview for a Marine Corps historical project. "I didn't believe him at first. Nobody did. But the birds don't lie. They never lied." The technique itself became so deeply embedded in Marine Corps jungle warfare training that most modern Marines don't know its origin. They learned to listen to environmental sounds as part of their basic combat awareness classes. They practiced the skill without knowing that it came from a 21-year-old private on Guadalcanal in 1942. But the rule remains unchanged. The jungle is full of warnings if you know how to hear them. The birds will tell you what you can't see. When the forest goes silent, something is wrong. The Japanese snipers of World War II were among the most patient, most effective killers ever used in combat. They tied themselves to trees and waited for days. They wore camouflage that made them invisible. They fired single shots from positions that couldn't be found, but they couldn't fool the birds. The natural world has its own warning system, millions of years older than human warfare. Every creature in the forest is constantly watching, constantly listening, constantly alert for predators. When something dangerous enters the environment, the animals respond. The Marines of Guadalcanal learned to tap into that warning system. They learned that the silence between bird calls was as important as the calls themselves. They learned to freeze when the jungle went quiet, to scan the treetops, to find the predator before it found them. It was simple observation, simple pattern recognition, the kind of environmental awareness that human beings had relied on for thousands of years before the invention of modern weapons. William Lansford didn't invent anything new. He remembered something old, something his grandfather had taught him in the pine forests of East Texas, something that soldiers had known since the first wars were fought in forests and jungles. The birds are watching. The birds always know. When they go silent, death is near. That knowledge, passed from a Cherokee tracker to a Texas boy to the Marine Corps of World War II, saved thousands of lives across the Pacific campaign. It's still saving lives today. The next time you're in the woods and the birds go quiet, remember what it means. Remember the Marines of Guadalcanal who learned to hear the silence. Remember William Lansford, the private who taught them to listen. The forest is talking. You just have to know how to hear it. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty files every day. Stories about Marines who survived by listening to what the jungle was trying to tell them. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in Texas, Germany, Australia, Japan? Our community stretches across the entire world. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in the Pacific. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure the bird silence technique doesn't disappear into silence. These lessons deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.